to my friends that live down in parts of the world that don't have this white stuff on the ground. The things that I'm wearing on my feet are probably pretty foreign to you, but up here they're an essential tool, and they're going to be part and parcel of my wee bit of history today. So if you like history, you'll have your favorite characters. So today I'm going to talk about a character that not only is my favorite, I find him one of the most fascinating, and that would be Robert Rogers. And the things I'm wearing on my feet have a lot to do with that story because, well, I'm going to get into that, and then I'll tell a wee bit of history about the man himself. So, some may say they're an awkward device, but if the snow's deep enough, it's really settling down now. It's a really peculiar temperature for this time of year, but some people think they're awkward. But if once you walk the first 50 miles or so, you hardly know they're there, and you wouldn't want to be without them. I can relate a modern story before I get into my historical story. And Kathy and I decided to do a late winter moose hunt because we still had a bull tag. So we went way north, so a latitude comparable to about the middle of James Bay. And we arrive and there's 3 feet of snow. It took us about 4 hours to shovel out that 3 feet to get our tent and wood stove into the tent and collect some firewood. And then it proceeded to snow some more. And we were at one point, a native fellow, a trapper, stopped by and he said, you know, if you guys are going to get out of here, you better go. There's a storm coming tomorrow. Well, we couldn't pack up in that sort of time, and the storm did hit. So when it's all said and done, we're taking turns shoveling a moat around the tent to keep the snow off of it. And we got about 5 feet of snow on the level, and even then, when it's light and powdery, one is walking up to or over their knees in this powder, and it is exhausting. You do 100 yards, you stop and rest. Anyway, at one point I fall over, and of course they've got all the accoutrements of a moose hunter on me, gun, etc. And I'm walling around like a beached whale, and fortunately Kathy was following along the trail behind me, and she extracted me from my predicament, because I'm pretty confident if she hadn't have been there, my old bones would be sun bleached there to this day. Anyway, in terms of, to set the stage for my story I'm going to tell, we're talking an era in the 1800s. It was called the Little Ice Age. And that starts around 1300 and goes right through to 1850. Number of causes for it: volcanic eruptions, currents, ocean currents. But according to climatologists, during that period, the temperature was approximately 2 degrees Celsius colder than normal. So that's, for my American neighbors, is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And the winters were hard, the winters were cold, the snow was deep, and that's the era that people lived in on the frontier of the colonies and in the Canadas in the time period of Robert Rogers, sorry. And it kind of sets the stage for the environment that they had to live, work, and fight their wars in. Anyway, best get moving. It is extremely hot for this time of year. First part of February in Canada. This is crazy. I'm not sure that the rangers would have done what I'm doing right now, but I learned the hard way that if you don't freshen up your pan every once in a while, you miss the deer of a lifetime. And I had an opportunity to take a monster at about 20 feet, and I had a flash in the pan, and it was a humid day, and I hadn't freshened up my pan at all. So anyway, I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to get comfortable here and tell you a little bit of the story about Robert Rogers. So any good story starts at the beginning. Robert Rogers was born November 7th, 1737 in the state of Massachusetts. And he was an Ulster Scot. His parents were Ulster Scot immigrants, and we did an episode, and we know how hard a fighting those folk are. When he's 8 years old, they uproot the family and they moved to New Hampshire. Think about it. Today, it doesn't seem like that far west, but that was the wilderness. That was the frontier at the time. It's also on the cusp of sort of no man's land, with the French colonies to the north, the English colonies to the south, and it's sort of a disputed area. He's educated. He learns to read and write. Not sure how, but he learns to speak French fairly fluently. And he doesn't see his first military action until the King George Wars, where he joins the New Hampshire militia. Now, that's his first military service, but he doesn't actually see any military action in that particular campaign. So his first real military service starts in 1755 when he's asked to form a company of men under, I believe it's James Winslow. And Winslow is sent to the Hudson Valley area under Sir William Johnson. And at this time, Rogers is recommended to Johnson as a being really good backwoodsman. I mean, he grew up in this area that was constant conflict and raids, and he knew how they fought. So, and Johnson takes him sort of under his wing, and he starts to do a number of reconnoitering trips into the Crown Point area. So 1756 sees Rogers asked to form the first Ranger Company, and it will become the first of many. And if we think about who comprised that first group, Rogers didn't really believe in the proper military etiquette and all that proper stuff, but he did believe in getting people that had the skills that he wanted: backwoodsmen, hunters, trappers. And he ends up with a very diverse group of people. He also believed strongly that he needed natives, and he had a strong liking for both the Mohawk and the Pequot nations, and his muster roll would reflect that. There were also a number of blacks that were part and parcel of the first Ranger group. I want to talk a little bit about this as we go along, but he writes out what he calls, I think it's the 28 rules of ranging. And kudos to him, that's still used to this very day in the U.S. military. Now, it's been modified a bit to reflect 250 years of time passing, but it is still used, that code, if you would, to train military in our modern world. So at this time, Rogers is a captain, but as these ranger companies are being formed, he quite quickly, I believe it's 1758, he's promoted to Major of His Majesty's Rangers. So he oversees them all. But this ragtag group of people, they prove to be very good at what they do: reconnoitering, scouting, particularly against the formidable French Canadians and their native allies. And it's not long before the upper echelon, who hate their unconventional tactics, if you would, that they see the merit in having these ranger companies assigned to them. And so as each new provincial company or corps is formed, they assign either one or two ranger companies to them. And that proves invaluable in the frontier battles that are going to be fought. So that brings me to the battle on snowshoes. And there were three of them, not one. There were three. And they're 3 consecutive years. So 1750, 1758, and 1759. All of them happen behind enemy lines. The first two are a disaster for the Robert Rangers, and the reason being, well, first of all, all three of them involve snowshoes, as you can imagine. And there are records of the French lamented the fact that they weren't issued them. And I find that hard to believe. That our guys are French-Canadian, for gosh sake, so they didn't give them snowshoes. So they're wallowing around in their knees, and the Rangers are on these guys, which gave them that advantage. But as I say, the first two are an absolute disaster. Robert is actually wounded twice in the first one. And in the second one, if you're interested in military history, I would encourage you to research a bit. And I'm not going to get into the details, but if you look at how they were fought, how they put up defenses, how they retreated uphill in the second battle to a place called Bald Mountain, and when it's almost dark in that particular battle, Roger realizes that he lost 50 men just in retreating uphill. And so he says disperse, which was one of the rules. If you go to that, I'm going to put them at the end of this episode, worth a read, to retreat. And they always had a common place where they would regather and see what they were to do at that point. So at this point, they find, when the French finally come up, and they find Roger's cloak and a satchel with some of his documents in it. And he's right at what they call, it's known today as Roger's Slide. And it's a 900-foot slide down to Lake George. And it's presumed that he slid down this thing. And today, whether it's mythology, whether there's some truth to it, he never talks about it in his account. So I'm thinking it didn't happen. But anyway, he loses a lot of men. In fact, he's decimated. And it's at that point he gets his major's promotion. You got to wonder at that. He loses the battle, gets a major's promotion. But I think the hierarchy in the military were coming to see the true worth of these Rangers and what they were prepared to do and the type of fighting they did. Now, the third battle on these guys, which takes place in 1759, is a success. And the Abenaki Nation have a village up very close to the St. Lawrence, and it has been the hub of them raiding up and down the New England colonies' frontiers and causing all kinds of havoc. And Rogers takes a company of men, and they go up there and they essentially kill everyone in the village. They burn the village to the ground, and it's at that point that Roger becomes a household name in America. I mean, his men are heroes, and he's a hero. Now, he eventually gets off to England, where he writes a book, I think with some help, because apparently his spelling was about as good as mine. So he gets help to write that their book. So the war certainly isn't over after these battles on snowshoes, and he takes part in a number of significant events after this, including the Battle of Bloody Run, which was a defeat for the British, but he's tasked with or given the task, I should say, of being the rear guard so the English troops can get away, and does a remarkable job of that. So now Rogers is using his fame to sell his book. It ultimately earns him an audience with King George III. He's full of energy because he tries to convince George to fund him to find the Northwest Passage. Anyway, he's back in the States. Now, he's earned the ire of General Thomas Gage, who thinks him a French spy. And he intercepts some of Rogers' mail, and he imprisons him in Montreal. And Rogers was there for the capitulation of Montreal, but now he's in prison and charged with being a traitor. Anyway, he fights it. He's acquitted. He sues Gage for improper imprisonment. Gage settles out of court. He's sent to Michilimackinac at this point. He makes 2 efforts to find the Northwest Passage, and you can imagine how well that went. So Rogers dies May 18th, 1795. He dies poor. He dies alone. He was totally bankrupt from before. He never got some of the pension he felt he was earned and was justified in getting. And it's a sad ending to a man who contributed so much. If we fast forward to 1992, he's now in the United States of America Rangers Hall of Fame. And as I mentioned earlier, those 28 rules of ranging, or the code of ranging, is still used to this day. But I think of the man personally, I don't think he was the atrocious, horrible character he was portrayed to. The program Turn, which was a wonderful series, pretty accurate in terms of accoutrements and storyline. It portrays him as this horrible villain. One has to remember that when the war starts, the French and Indian War, or sorry, the American Revolution starts, Roger wants to sign up with Washington. But at some point in the discussions, Washington thinks, well, he can't really trust his loyalty. Well, Rogers is a fighting man. He signs up with the king, and we know where that goes and how well that went for him. But that series portrays him as this horrible man. But I think because he was able to, I think he was tough. I think he was hard on his men. But if people followed him, I don't think he was the horrible villain. Sadly, he had a real liking for hard liquor. And yeah, he ends up poor and alone when he dies. Anyway, that's a wee bit of history of what I find one of the more interesting characters of the 18th century. Yeah, and I should get going. I'm going to lose my sun. It's going down. The shadows are getting longer here. It's worth noting that in the first two battles on snowshoes, Rogers actually broke his own rules. In the first instance, they were on their way back. They captured 6 French. They held a meeting. His lieutenants voted to disperse and go back by a different route. Rogers thought the snow deep and it would be faster if they went back the same way. They were ambushed and a lot of men were lost. In the second case, it was always to be keep oneself unaware to the enemy, and they decided to hold a shooting match, some kind of a competition, which signaled to the French where they were. And again, we know what happened in the second battle on snowshoes, so a lot of men were lost as a result of that. Anyway, the rules are at the end. It is an interesting read.